From the United Nations Office to the African Union, this is She Stands for Peace, a podcast series where I explore the state of the women, peace and security agenda in Africa through a series of conversations with key actors. In the podcast, we ask the central question, 20 years after UNSCR 1325, how far have we come? I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, your host, and today I'm joined by Miss Betty Bigombe, Special Envoy of Uganda to the South Sudan Peace Process. Ms. Bigombe joins me from Kampala, and we have a conversation about the participation of women in formal and informal peace negotiations and mediation. Now, I must warn you, this episode does contain graphic details about violence and death. Ms. Bigombe, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. You were the former Minister of State for Northern Uganda and the chief mediator between the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA, and the Ugandan government. Now, you've got a fascinating history, and there's so many points in your work around peace and security that we could possibly start this conversation from. And when you and I met in Addis Ababa in 2020, we had a lot of conversations about those years. So I want to take you back to Mount Ajulu at 5 a.m. on the 2nd of May, 1992. This was your first face-to-face meeting with the leader of the LRA, Joseph Kony, after 2 years where you guys were exchanging letters, and the beginning of what came to be known as the Bigombe 1 talks. So walk us through your journey to meet Kony and that first encounter with him.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to having this conversation. That meeting of 2nd of May, it was a secret meeting. Basically, what I wanted to find out was whether among them, there were some of his followers were keen for peace talks. So this was just to lay the ground for a meeting with Kony and for me to get a sense of whether they were ready for peace talks. It almost took 2 years, and eventually he accepted that we should physically meet. He asked me to go with 6 people. None of them should be armed. This is a deadly group, fanatics who believe they get their command from God. So the first thing that came into my mind was that why not approach religious leaders? So I went out and reached the various religious leaders, the Anglican bishop, I reached out the Catholic and the Muslim, and they all welcomed this very warmly. They were happy to go with me. And then when the day came, lo and behold, the Catholic bishop then sent me a very nice note. We wish you all the best. We're praying for you. It's time to bring peace, but it's not yet time for us to go with you. But we leave you in the hands of God. The Anglican bishop traveled to Kampala, the city of Uganda, did not leave any message at all for anybody. Then to the Muslim, who then said he had malaria, he wishes me all the best, but unfortunately, he could not join me. It was a moment of split decision. And that moment I said, I have to go. I cannot abort this now, this great opportunity. So it was a very lonely journey by car. Now we reached that spot. The soldiers that escorted me had to stop at that point. You know, you're all alone. You're in the hands of the rebels. Anything could happen, but you keep on walking. So then went into the jungle in their hands, met another group that was very hostile. One of them jumped out of the bush and just grabbed my neck. But their leader said, no, stopped him, held him back. What will never get off my mind were the girls who were holding AK-47, were the child soldiers, 7, 8, 10 years old, and eventually arrived at the venue. This is really a jungle. It would be very, very difficult to detect anybody staying in that place. And finally, I do not know how Jesus is going to come. This was like about 10 in the morning after I'd sat there, waited. His coming in was very dramatic. You have the so-called choir singing hymns, And some of them were dressed like nuns, some of them were dressed like priests. And then you had some of them falling down that they had demons, and his presence just expelled the demons. It's a scene that is very difficult to describe.
How are you feeling in all of this?
No fear. Really, I had these guys at me with their AK-47, not blinking. No movement whatsoever. The way they're trained is just incredible. They acted like robots.
And these were kids, these were children.
These were children. The youngest, they were about 7, 8 years old. So I was totally surrounded. I didn't want to be taken hostage. That was something that scared me to death. So I thought in my mind, if I sense real danger, I would rush and grab a gun, because at that moment in time, they'll just pump bullets into you and you'll die fast. So that was something that I had in my mind. We started late, so we rescheduled. So he then suggested, you're going to spend the night here so that we can resume tomorrow very early in the morning. So, despite the fact that my heart was pumping like crazy, I got up very firm and I said, God is great. We've been hostile towards one another. You're now even inviting me to spend the night and eat with you. In our culture, once you eat together, then you're no longer enemies. However, I'm wearing two hats. On the one hand, I'm your mother, you're all my children, but I'm also wearing the hat of the government. The government is anxiously waiting for me. If they wait for a very long time, then they will think I'm in danger, in which case they'll be tempted to rescue me, and that rescue would be deadly, and some of us will die in the process. This is an excellent gesture, but I'm begging you to please let me go, and I promise I'll be here very early in the morning. Then his next offer was, I'm going to give you escorts, well armed, to walk you, because I came on foot. And I said, again, I'm so grateful that you even want to protect me. But again, my fear is, if we meet government troops, they might think that I'm a hostage. Then there will be confrontation, which we must avoid. You told me to come alone, and God watched me and brought me here. And I'm going to go back alone. Just pray that I get there well. They reconvened maybe for about 10 minutes and came back and said, God bless you. You can go. And you have no idea the relief I had.
I want to ask a second question now, because in that short space of time, you've built a sense of familiarity, a sense of trust. So, had he started to call you mother by this point, or was that later?
The next day I became mother. He said the first thing was, we never believed you would venture and come to see us. We thought you were going to run away and probably send other people and not you personally come. And so my walking in, meeting all his demands and risking my life was a clear testimony that I was committed.
I'm just trying to picture everything you've been through in this space of barely 2 days. And like I said earlier on, building that level of familiarity and trust, in quotes, with somebody like Kony. You know, he's responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 people, if not more, abductions of tens of thousands of children, sexual violence against women and girls, some of whom we kept as sexual slaves, which is again something that was, so brave of your journey. And the UN estimates that 80% of his soldiers were children. So my question to you is, from a perspective of a mediator, how do you look past that and build that familiarity and trust?
It's out of desperation. When you're dealing with a situation where children are dropping dead every day like flies, when you're dealing with a situation where the rebels go into internally displaced camps, abduct people, some are killed, maimed, the young ones are taken, and the parents run to you and say, please save us. They're wailing, you are helpless. You want to give them hope. Believe me, even you would leave what you're doing today and try to do it because it stops being a job. It becomes the driving force is so strong that this is a monster I should not even talk to, but I have to talk to him if it can end the sufferings, the distractions, the helplessness and hopelessness of people who are directly affected. So it's the driving force. It's nothing more than that. That is why I totally believe in engagement, whether it's Boko Haram, Al Shabaab, ISIS, because I've talked to some of these extremists and they say, you know, we resort to some of these things because we want to be heard. So to me, I knew it was very important to get him to trust me that I can deliver peace to him as well as his followers.
So the Bigombe One Talks, which is what the initial intervention with Kony was called, that resulted in a 9-month ceasefire. But then again, after that 9 months, for a variety of factors, the violence broke out again, and even more lives were lost. Now you featured in the book, She Stands for Peace, which inspires this podcast series, and the book celebrates 20 women, African women like yourselves, who contribute to the women, peace, and security agenda. And in the book, in relation to this return to violence after the ceasefire, you said that you suffered a complete breakdown at the sight of the lives lost again during this renewed violence, to the extent that you even left Uganda, you left the country. So I want you to reflect on this time and even your other experiences of mediation. What is the personal toll for you as a mediator, as a negotiator, when you put yourself in such danger and then all your hard work, you witness that going down the drain when the talks descend again into violence and the agreements break down? So, what is the personal toll for you as a mediator?
Any peace talks, when it breaks down, is devastating because when the factions go back to war and more lives are lost, more distractions take place, and people become even more desperate and hopeless. It's very devastating because in your mind, as a mediator, you know some of these things could have been avoided. And I don't know about other mediators. You take it personally. Where could I have gone wrong? Maybe I should have done things differently. But in mediation, you must know there's so many spoilers, so many external forces that is always fighting the success of the mediation. So the first thing that happened was when the rebels, after the first peace talks did not work out, they came into a small trading center where there's a small, they call it a technical school, and just massacred over 300 people. I went into deep depression. I had pains that I couldn't even explain. And to make it worse, I was one of the first at the site where people were massacred. We couldn't do anything to carry away the bodies. 2 days later, the shallow graves we had, mass graves we had made, animals had come to eat up the bodies. And those are things that you cannot just rub off your mind. Where it happened, there were no roads. People had to walk about 14 kilometers, identify their people, and carry a few, leave the rest. Vehicles couldn't access the place. So it was really, really terrible. So it gave me time to reflect because I know if I dealt with some of the spoilers earlier, but I was naive because in my mind was, who would not want peace? There was the woman element. How can we allow a woman to succeed in here? And this is true. These are facts. I think I mentioned this in the piece I wrote. Government soldiers are beating. If you go to, I've been to North Nigeria. Soldiers are benefiting from the war. They start profiteering, and therefore the war drags on and on. If I had dealt with those earlier, I knew it was happening, but I just kind of ignored it. So I blamed it on myself.
That's a heavy burden to put on your own shoulders. It's a whole conflict that is beyond you.
You're right, but it's what if I had the opportunity to stop this, to engage this group. But I didn't because I was naive enough to think that everybody wants peace. So it's this what ifs.
I want to expand a little bit more, if I may, on the mental health impact of these things on mediators. You're an independent mediator. Does the peace building industry, the stakeholders, the policymakers, do they speak enough and even consider enough the mental health impact for mediators of meeting with people like Kony, of dealing with the atrocities, of dealing with the aftermath when things don't go right?
I'm so happy you're bringing that aspect out because we started some debate led by Oxford University on this psychological impact of mediation on mediators, what they go through. And it's often not talked about. It's often very much ignored, swept under the carpet. People just don't think about it because my kind of mediation, the initial mediation, was not the sophisticated mediation because you do not have any institution behind you. You don't have a fallback position. So it's a lonely journey. You try to process everything as they come along. Irrespective of that, and what we must not forget is that you're under scrutiny all the time. You're being judged all the time. So you're walking a tightrope. The factions are watching you. Are you doing the right thing? Are you protecting their interest? Or maybe you're neutral. And one little word that you said, you're judged immediately. The other people, the spectators or external forces, are also observing you. You're being judged all the time. And you want to be superhuman. You're desperate to satisfy or to perform to everybody's satisfaction. But we are all human and we make mistakes. So, the psychology, that is why mediators, oftentimes, most of them are very frustrated, angry people that believe they're not appreciated because people are very quick to judge them.
You have mentioned before that the LRA commanders took President Museveni's sending of you, a woman, to negotiate with them. They took that as an insult and a sign that the president wasn't serious about the peace talks. Having had all these years of experiences as a negotiator, as a woman negotiator, you know the challenges and opportunities it presents to peace talks and what women at the negotiating table means, right? And I put table in quotes because your story is a perfect example that shows that the table, yeah, the table is sometimes the bush, you know. So my question is, looking forward, how can the peace building community better support the participation of women in both formal and informal peace negotiation processes?
In this was 1993. So at that time, there were hardly women mediators. But let me also confess, even as I started the process, I didn't know that I was mediating. It was just peace talks. It's just trying to bring peace and trying to work out the agenda. What were their issues? How could they be addressed? So I personally didn't know what I was doing. I was working for peace, period. So trying to come up with the agenda, drawing up what we needed, what were the issues, was very random. Then, of course, it was not just the rebels who said, get out of here. This is a male domain. This is a big insult. If you don't get out, we will kill you. But it's also the population, the ordinary people. Just say, what's going on? Bringing, of course, I was much younger then, bringing in a girl to handle war, real war. This is total lack of seriousness. Even women came out and said, she's going to run away. There's no way a woman can handle this kind of conflict, which is extremely violent. There were those who even thought I must be a girlfriend to Museveni, and that's why he would task me to do something like that. You're always a girlfriend. So he wants you away from everybody where your husband is not. So who would go to a war zone? Only a president. So really at that time it was not just the rebels that felt insulted. Everybody perceived it as lack of seriousness, but also not wanting to end the war. So that was then the perception. It's changed, but we have a long, long way to go. Slowly, women are being brought into. However, it's still not as chief mediators. This is my biggest problem. Okay, is it demand driven? No, it's supply driven because the donors to peace talks always insist women must be at the table. So what happens is that the factions bring their people who are loyal to them, but not women who articulate women's issues. What I look forward to and hope it will happen very soon is that institutions like African Union can appoint women as chief mediators. I look forward to seeing UN appointing women and other regional organizations to test the ability of women. It's not just testing the ability of women, but it also helps to prove the value added women bring to the table, which is not. Because if you take Africa, for example, the norm is to appoint a former head of state who has political clout. Yes, that is true. But that does not necessarily mean that he is a mediator. Mediator takes more than just classroom learning, ability to listen, patience. I've seen men who come in and say, we have to get this done by date so and so. You're talking to people who have killed one another. You're talking to people who deeply distrust one another. And you cannot just say, sign it. Okay, I participated in the peace talks between Uganda government and Sudan by President Carter. I was on President Carter's team. And one, President Carter used very Western Camp David style of mediation, where he moved from met the president of Sudan alone, met Ugandan delegation, eventually said, they're ready for peace talks. I'm not in any way relegating that process. But the point was that two people who have fought need to read one another's chemistry and vent out their anger and frustrations. You cannot just say, I've talked to so and so. They will do it because it is President Carter and agree and sign. But the test of the success is implementation of the agreement. And indeed, the two parties did sign the agreement, but it was never implemented. Up to today, it sat there and collected dust.
I'm going to return to implementation in just a second, but I've got one question to ask to unpack with you first before we move on there. You returned to start what was again called the Bigombe 2 talks. This was early 2000. And this time around, using your own finances, I read somewhere that you used about $8,500 in your attempt to broker peace. And once again, after you'd seen the news report on CNN, you flew back and tried to kind of broker a new round of peace there. And eventually, those peace talks did break down again, but it laid the foundation for the Juba peace agreement. And you said of this second round of negotiations that you realized the mistake of not involving the international community in that first round of talks. And again, as you've described in this podcast, that actually that initial round of talks was you didn't even realize you're in a formal process of mediation. So it was still a lot of just natural engagement as opposed to a structured process. And the WPS agenda is full of men and women like yourselves, peace builders at the grassroots, using their own means, taking enormous risks to interact and peace build in their communities. But not many of them have the same access and, frankly, the financial means for them to do things the way you have. And so, thinking of yourself in the space of being an independent mediator, what are the pros and cons of that versus that kind of formal structure of mediation?
When you are mediating on behalf of an institution, you're kind of insulated, cushioned. But as an independent mediator, you're very much on your own. But the upside of that is you are not tied up by rules and regulations of institutions. I'll give you an example. I wanted satellite phones, and I asked the UN if they could provide satellite phones to ease communication between us. Because then UN also came in. UN can never buy satellite phones for rebels. So it has to go to this committee to be discussed, to approve that money. what are the pros and cons. Whereas if I had money, I would simply supply them. So you're not bound by the rules and regulations, which are oftentimes very, very, very rigid. The concern is more protecting the institution or the organization's image and not breaking the rules and regulations, whereas war knows no rules or regulations. Things just happen. So you need to be flexible. So I would say, as an independent one, you can exercise many rights provided you have resources. But these resources also come in with rules and regulations, with some stringent measures of the do's and don'ts. So I would assemble a team supported. For example, the South Sudan peace talks that is going on. The Troika is composed of the Americans, the British, and the Norwegians. Now, it's more flexible on how they control the process or controlling the resources. So it's, I would say, a hybrid of donors would always make it more flexible, because you're not going to follow the British rules and regulations, neither the UN one. So you reach a middle ground. But it's also terribly risky to be on your own. The so-called Betty Two initiative, I was very vulnerable because I was working as an individual, although I had the support of the Dutch, the British, the Norwegians, UN. The US came in later. But even then, it was still the Betty Bigombe peace talks. Whereas if it was an institution, I'd rather have UN led, but with other countries or international organizations joining in.
I want to return to what you were saying about implementation. You're currently the special envoy of the peace process in South Sudan, and like you said earlier on, we've got the Juba Peace Agreement. What have you learned from your experiences in Uganda, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, Colombia, all these places where you've served as a mediator? What have you learned about that next part of the job of being negotiator after the fanfare of the agreements and the celebrations of the agreements is over? And what can we do better in terms of that next implementation stage?
What is really, really very frustrating to me as a mediator is that once an agreement has been reached, signed, we toast champagne, congratulate one another, and everybody goes. It's no longer sexy. Nobody wants to oversee the implementation. My strongest recommendation is that signing of an agreement should not be the end of the process. The team must remain on. Case in point, the South Sudan implementation is dragging on. There's no pressure group. But it's not only that. When you come to implementation, what really hit me later is that even the interpretation of the agreement is absolutely necessary during implementation. I've seen it in South Sudan where this clause reads like this and this and this. But what does it mean to the implementers who did not participate in the process? It also brings delays. So you need the technical team to stay there to interpret the agreement to them so that it is implemented the way it is meant to be. But more importantly, to put pressure on the factions to ensure that they implement what they're supposed to be. And there's got to be also some mechanism to make them accountable if they default in the implementation, because there can be very easy relapses to war. Everything is still very delicate, and consequently, you cannot leave them on their own and say, run, move on. So, mechanism of making the parties accountable, pressure, some kind of pressure is necessary, and interpretation of the agreement. But in all this, we jump into implementation. We totally ignore trust building among the parties or even the fractured communities. It's not only at the leadership level that they deeply distrust one another. I think reconciliation should be factored into the implementation of any form of agreement. But that sets the foundation for implementing all these other activities that are laid out in the agreement. Because otherwise, they deeply distrust one another. That suspicion goes on. Everybody looks at through the lens of that group and that faction. not anymore as that they're coming in as one people, trying to build a nation and have shared vision for their countries. That is what I would prescribe.
Thank you so much, Miss Bigombe. Now, I've got one final question, really. So, we've talked about your work. Tell us something interesting about you, an interesting fact that we won't find on Google.
Oh, that's a very tricky question. I just want to continue to mediate. I'm very passionate about it. Peace is not just silencing the gun. We need to look at peace in a very holistic manner. Are people secure enough to go into their homes and sleep and dance, eat what they have? Are they living in dignity? What gives me a lot of gratification is when I go to these rural, remote villages and I find children playing. It's like we used to play in the night when I was young, moonlight. You make noise. You're not worried about being killed or your parents being abducted and taken away. So if I can go to any country, today I'm itching to go to Myanmar. I'm itching to go to the Gaza. I've been itching to go to Syria. Just what can we do to save these people? It's so heartbreaking to sit helpless and not knowing what to do. So that you will not find in Google. You can only find by talking to me. And I hope I'll be able to continue to do that and make a difference in people's lives. The other thing is to mentor young women. Then basically instill the idea of peace. Not just young women, boys. We need to bring them in because they're usually the fighters. So we need to nurture our young people. If I had a way, I would have peace programs in the school syllabus in all developing countries.
It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you and to hear your story. You are such an inspiration and one of my favorite people in the world. So thank you so much for doing this interview.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, and all the best.
You have been listening to She Stands for Peace, the podcast series that explores the state of the women, peace, and security agenda in Africa, asking the central question 20 years after UNSCR 1325, how far have we come? I'm Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, your host, and this podcast was produced by the United Nations Office to the African Union with the generous support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs.